Hello and welcome to our crypto regulation and policy show. We are live on our social channels every other Thursday, discussing the most pressing industry issues, challenges, and wins. I'm your host, Jen Sanassi, joined by my co-host, partner at Paul Hastings, Renato Mariotti. Renato, so nice to see you.
Good to see you, Jen. What a week.
What a week. Every time I see you, I say so much has happened since the last time we've met right here on the show. And I just got to ask you, what are you watching? A lot has happened in the past 5 days.
Oh my goodness. Well, we've all been waiting for potential executive orders to come out. None
Mhm.
that are specifically focused on crypto yet, but a whole host of activity. We have new acting chairs for all the agencies. Some of them are releasing statements. There's a task force that I know we're going to talk about, and just a whole host of other things coming in the days forward.
I feel like we're going to have to make this show a once a week thing. There's just too many stories to cover. We have the SEC Crypto Task Force. We have Ross Ulbricht's full pardon. We're going to talk about everything that has to do with the FDIC, the CFTC, the SEC on today's show. Before we get to our first guest, though, I want to remind our audience who's watching, we are across all of our social channels and you have the opportunity to engage with us. So if you have a question for me, Renato, or our guest, or you have a comment, put that right below this video and we will try to get to it during the live stream. Okay, let's welcome in our first guest now, a friend of CoinDesk. He's been on the show before, Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs, Ari Redboard. Ari, nice to see you.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation today. And to your point, it's only been a week. This is just absolutely wild. Lots to talk about.
I want to say that these events kind of kicked off with the crypto ball, which you were at on Friday evening. It really was a spectacle to watch from afar. I wasn't there. Maybe just talk to us about what it was like to be there. What kind of conversations were people having?
It was a really special night, and it was a combination of a whole bunch of things. Obviously, it was a celebration, and I was sort of going to it for that. But honestly, the conversations were as extraordinary as any sort of big crypto conference that I've attended. And I think it was a lot of folks are in that policy, legal, regulatory space, and the conversations were around, all right, big night, let's celebrate this thing, but really excited to support the work that you're doing, or hey, what's next? What are the things we should be focusing on? So like it was this combination of really fun, Snoop Dogg in the house vibes and all of that excitement. But I think it also like I really had some cool, serious conversations with builders and policymakers. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from the evening.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up these conversations because I think that many of the crypto conferences have those types of conversations. They foster innovation, but there's always been this almost like this dark cloud looming that has been lifted very quickly. A lot has happened in the past 3 days since the inauguration here in the United States. I want to get a little bit more foundation, a little bit more flour from you, Ari. What's the mood in DC right now, especially as it pertains to the conversation on crypto?
I think it remains exciting. And Renato at the outset mentioned sort of the waiting. I feel like it's, I don't know, a sports draft waiting to see who gets picked next, or,
Mhm.
or that type of excitement around an executive order or sort of what's happening next. But with some of the moves of the CFTC and the SEC, we're already starting to see the building towards this type of legal clarity that the space is so excited about. I will say that like it's not just this week, right? I mean, since the election, we've seen really important appointments from David Sachs as crypto czar. I mean, I think that one of the things at the crypto ball was a conversation around like, can you believe that this role even exists at all today, right? That is an exciting moment. Paul Atkins brings his business acumen and regulatory expertise to the SEC. You now have Carolyn Pham, commissioner, and now acting head of the CFTC. So I think there's a lot of excitement, but a lot of this had already started before Treasury Secretary appointments. A lot of this had already started before the inauguration.
So, Ari, I'm curious. What do you make of the new crypto task force at the SEC? I mean, it's interesting. obviously, the legislation that had been contemplated had given a much larger role to the CFTC. There's been some speculation that the CFTC would really be a leader in the space. Obviously, the SEC wants to plant its own flag.
Yeah, no, I think it's an exciting moment. And, we've had this narrative over the last few years, I think primarily around the CFTC because the SEC, there was so much tension between the SEC and the industry, less so with the CFTC. But now we see a new administration, we see new leadership at the top of both of those regulatory entities. And I think there's an open question now as to who will ultimately regulate the space. And where I'm hopeful is both. And I think that's what the market structure bill anticipates. And I think that's what a lot of conversation is. And what I'm really excited about is, we had this announcement of an SEC task force with Hester Peirce, who has been just an outstanding, not only advocate for the industry, but really advocate for thoughtful regulation that allows innovation to grow and technology to grow in the United States. So that's an incredibly exciting moment to have someone with that level of leadership, with that level of expertise, with that level of dedication to building as the head of this initiative at the SEC. What I'm equally excited about is to have the leadership of the SEC and the CFTC collaborate, whether that's a task force or whether it's just conversation. When folks, over the last few days have been asking me what executive orders I'd potentially be excited about, it would be an executive order that orders those regulators to come together to at least propose to Congress what legal clarity would look like, what a joint partnership between these two regulators would look like. And that's very much within, obviously, the executive branch function. That excites me. So having Hester Peirce, having Caroline Pham, having Margarita, I think that these people coming together, David Sachs, the whole Treasury team coming together and making recommendations to Congress, I think is the next move. And that's really, really exciting.
We talked a little bit about all of the headlines that keep coming out after inauguration. And I just want to point to one that came out just before we started recording. Senator Lummis was officially named the chair of the Senate Banking Subcommittee on Digital Assets. She has been a big proponent of the industry. And Ari, I think I've asked you this before, but I think it's important to ask it again. The SEC and the CFTC, as you both alluded to, have previously kind of been in competition over the digital asset space. And now there are new chairs, there is new staff there. But does that competitive nature still remain? And are these two agencies able to work together given what we've seen happen in the past?
Yeah, no, look, I spent 11 years at the Department of Justice and 2 at the Treasury Department, so I stay out of the squabbles between the financial regulators. But I do go back to kind of my last statement on this, and I think that now with new leadership, and quite frankly, the president and David Sachs and others who are, in the White House directing, right? I mean, these regulators work for the president. And when the president says, hey, look, we need to put our heads together, and that means the CFTC, the SEC, the FDIC, Treasury, the Fed, and everyone else, to make recommendations for sound regulatory policymaking, that's what I'm excited about. So I think that is very much within the authority of the president, right? He's the boss at the end of the day, and he's deputized David Sachs in this role. And that's the type of thing you can order in an executive order, or even just, just doing it. You could tell these entities, these regulators to come together and start to build something, and then ultimately make those recommendations to Congress. So that I think is where this is headed, because again, the president and David Sachs, they're the bosses on this, and they can essentially order the staff and then the leadership of these agencies to come together. And I think they should.
Yeah, I do. I think that there's energy at at both commissions really to work together. I know that Caroline Pham has talked about the fact that there's already a framework in place for the two commissions to work together. There's already a task force that was really started during the flash crash era that they could resurrect and have a sort of a joint effort. But I'm really curious, Ari, what you think going forward will happen to the enforcement matters that we have pending. I mean, it's like the end of a movie where you have like all these the robots have all like run out of juice, and you're like, okay, what's going to happen now? And all the alien attack is ending. What's going to happen? And what do we think the different the two commissions are going to do with those matters?
It's a great question. It just sort of, again, as a prosecutor and a treasury, always thinking about illicit finance and anti-money laundering and now a TRM, I think of enforcement actions these days in sort of two buckets. And I think you're talking about the first one primarily, and that's the bucket of enforcement actions against lawful cryptocurrency businesses for essentially listing unregistered securities. And I think ultimately, in large part, those will go away. And you're hearing already about some meetings at the SEC and CFTC that are going to potentially try to evaluate, hopefully on a case by case basis, but hopefully say, look, we're going to stop going after lawful actors within a growing ecosystem. And I think that's the first bucket. And I actually think you're going to see that. There is a second bucket. And I think it's also really important to continue to prosecute or those types of enforcement actions. And those are against actual bad actors in the space, right? We still see money laundering. We put out a report at TRM last week that said illicit finance has been cut in half, essentially. We're looking at about 0.4% of all activity within the crypto ecosystem is illicit. That means, 99+% is lawful activity. But it's still bad, right? We still see 10 billion in scams. We still see North Korea attacking crypto businesses at almost $1 billion a year, right? We still have to go after those bad actors and stop that activity. So what I'm hoping is that these lawful, taking the eye off of the lawful actors in this space and continuing to focus on the actual bad guys is what we're going to see in this administration, and I think we will.
On that note, Ari, I want to ask you about something that happened just before the inauguration. I think it happened while you were at the crypto ball. Trump, the president of the United States, launched a meme coin, the Trump meme coin. And this has begged a few different questions I've seen people talking on crypto Twitter about. There's a story on CoinDesk.com today about two House Democrats who are questioning if this is a conflict of interest. As Trump signs in executive orders, as we get friendlier stance on crypto across many different government agencies, does Trump having his own meme coin, does him having a part in World Liberty Financial put him in a position that maybe creates a conflict?
I will give the conflict question a shot. And I think that, look, Trump has built an empire. He's been a businessman his entire career. In the last Trump administration, there were all these questions swirling around, are there conflicts and how does he sort of deal with those things? I think he did then, and I think we'll see him attempt to do now in this instance. But I don't know if it's super relevant towards sort of the way ultimately crypto policy will shake out. I think we're already seeing sort of leadership with really true expertise at these different agencies. And I think we'll kind of continue to see that. I think there's all kinds of other interesting questions around meme coins. And I think Trump has now essentially taken them to an entirely different level, right? While we've had advocates for different coins over the years, famously Doge in particular and a few others, Elon Musk, we've never had a president of the United States. And I think it's taken the space in an interesting direction, arguably a more serious direction. At TRM, we closely monitor the Solana ecosystem, which is filled with meme coin activity for rug pulls and other types of scams. I will say today, as I sit here, this does not have the indicia of that. We see it sort of leveling off. We see some stability around the coin, at least for meme coins, which are 24/7 instability typically. We see major reputable exchanges in the US listing Trump coin. So I certainly think that as someone who really looks at this space closely for scams and other types of activity, we're not seeing that as we look here today. We're seeing a lot of individuals engage with this. And I think there's an open question about what role meme coins will play in the ecosystem. Sometimes I can't believe I talk about them, right? Like Hawk Tua and Squid Coin, and but I do think that there's a role here, particularly for a new generation of investors that are sort of 24/7 digital, online, social media driven. And this is just sort of the greatest example ever, and we'll see how it plays out.
You mentioned there's a lot of interesting questions around meme coins. I mean, when you think about how policymakers are going to look at meme coins now that Trump has one as well, what are some of those interesting questions that you're pondering?
I think that what role do they play in a financial system is sort of the most interesting one to me, right? To me, it's very clear what role Bitcoin, as a store of value, or what Ethereum has in terms of people building on that blockchain and using that asset. And I think Solana, obviously, very clear. XRP. I think meme coins have always sort of like, what exactly is this and what are you investing in? But I do think that like there's this really interesting question around internet culture, around social media culture, about like wanting to engage with something because of the person behind it or because of what it is. So I think that to me is like some really interesting questions. Is this just a phase in the sort of building of this new financial system, or are these things going to play an actual role here? If they ever were, it's going to be things like Doge and maybe Trump that really sort of accelerate the pace of development and give us a sense of meaning. But I think it's an open question today.
One thing that I thought was interesting, Ari, to switch gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about Commissioner and now Acting Chair Pham. She, of course, had an announcement right away saying that she had a policy director, essentially a chief of staff, who's going to be focusing on crypto policy for the agency. You also saw the FDIC acting chair put out a statement that talked about their focus now on making sure that they adopted more crypto-friendly policies. A lot of folks in the space are wondering about banking and access to banking. I'm curious if you think that potentially the FDIC, may play a role in facilitating access to banking for a lot of folks in the space.
I absolutely do. I mean, I think famously the letter that went to financial institutions from the financial regulators, about 2 years ago, I think was really a watershed in this sort of assault on crypto businesses. And I think that we're going to see this administration not only back away from that letter, but likely encourage investment in this space. And remember, it's not just crypto, right? The way sort of like this is CoinDesk, people are very deep in this, but this is sort of like American leadership in innovation and technology in the world, right? We won the internet, the age of the internet. And I think the challenge for us is we need to win the age of digital assets, of AI and emerging technology. And I think that ultimately is sort of the big picture view that this administration is going to have. I think crypto is going to be a part of that, but there's a reason David Sachs isn't just crypto czar, right? He's crypto and AI czar, because I think it's, hey, look, the US needs to lead in this era of technology the same way we did in the previous era. So I think we're going to see, the FDIC piece is important because we need investment. We need access to banking services for businesses that are building technology. So ultimately, my view is we will see activity from the FDIC, and it will be really important. But what I'm excited about is the things that can happen through executive action, and all the things that we've talked about today, short of legal clarity, legislation, can be handled through executive action. And I think we'll see that sooner rather than later. Remember, I think one thing that's important to remember about the Trump administration, particularly this time around, is we've got 4 years, right? That administration has 4 years, and having served in the previous administration, I can tell you there was urgency then. There's going to be a lot more urgency now.
All right, Ari, we are going to have to wrap it there. It is
Oh,
always
come on.
I know, it's always
Great.
I know, it's always such a pleasure talking to you. And now is your opportunity to pressure me to run with you
We're going to
at
do this,
some
right?
point.
Toronto, we're doing it. I've got the TRM hat ready to go for you.
Renato doesn't know, but Ari has a running club, and there is a running club meetup at, I don't know if it's every consensus, Ari, or did you start it at last consensus?
So this was the first year it was an official event of Consensus, which was so cool. We had about 75 people show up in Austin running the streets with us. So
Wow.
Renato, if you're in Toronto, we're going to do it again, or in DC sometime. But yeah, it was really cool. But Jen has absolutely promised in front of thousands of, if
I
not
really
millions of
have.
people a couple times. So this is going to happen.
Well, it's going to be a little cooler, hopefully, than it was in Austin last time, because that was
Pretty hot.
a brutal run.
Yeah, we have tough people for the TRM running club, so they were fine out there.
All
Hey
right.
guys, thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Ari. As always, it was a pleasure, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.
Okay, that was TRM Labs Global Head of Policy, Ari Redford. Renato, we still got so much to talk about. And just off of what we were talking about just now about the FDIC and those letters to banks, it reminded me of the conversation you and I had with Coinbase Chief Legal Officer Paul Graywall. Coinbase is, of course, in a suit against the FDIC over those same letters. We're going to talk about the recent developments there. But I pose the same question you posed to Ari to you. What happens to that now that we have Travis Hill, who we can see on the screen now, more crypto-friendly acting chair at the FDIC? What happens to that?
Yeah, I think actually you're going to see radical transparency regarding the prior administration's actions in relation to debanking people in the crypto space. So I do think that Paul is going to meet with very sympathetic ears now from acting chair Hill. I mean, I think it's very telling that in his first day as acting chair, he released a statement talking about his commitment to this space. I don't think that that was an accident. I think it was a sign. So yeah, I think that we're going to start seeing. There's already Anchorage and so forth, but you're going to see a lot more banking in and around the space. Not just traditional banks entering the space and providing services to folks who are here, but I think more innovative services being offered as well.
All right, let's dig a little bit deeper into that recent development I just mentioned. On Monday, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit issued an opinion requiring the SEC to provide a more complete explanation for its refusal to engage in non-formal notice and comment rulemaking regarding the application of securities laws to digital assets. Now, the court found that the one-paragraph denial of Coinbase's request was insufficiently reasoned and arbitrary and capricious. And I just want to correct myself. I think I linked this to the FDIC Coinbase case, and they are two separate cases. So, Renato, talk to me about the significance of this.
Yeah, first of all, Coinbase has a lot of litigation. They have been very aggressive, and this really is, I think, a remarkable decision. That's why we're going a little bit back in the time machine. What is this? Just several days to last week to talk about this one because it's pretty rare that a private company sues the SEC and gets a court, in this case, the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, to say that their actions were arbitrary. I thought it's remarkable because it's really a statement regarding the entire approach that the SEC took. Essentially, what happened was Coinbase went to the SEC and said, "We need rulemaking. We need you to give us a path to register." And the SEC gave them that one paragraph denial, as you mentioned, and sued them. And what I thought was remarkable is all three judges of the Court of Appeals ruled that that was arbitrary and capricious and ordered the SEC to provide an explanation. And there was a concurrence by Judge Stephanos Bibas, a celebrated jurist, who said essentially that Coinbase was right, the entire approach that the SEC took was misguided, and that the SEC better come back with something more than their usual sort of the usual statements that we've been getting over the last few years of a bunch of hand waving. So that was really interesting. He was relatively very pointed for a judge, I would say, in his statement, and I think a lot of people are going to be able to look at that and see some vindication for the industry.
Make sense of this a little bit more for me. I mean, where does this fit in everything we've been talking about? I mean, we spoke to Paul Graywell not long ago, and he has a large team. They've spent a lot of money fighting with the SEC in court. What does this mean to have a judge say, like, actually, Coinbase is right and what's been happening is wrong? Like, uh, just talk to me about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, well, one thing that's important to note is that even no matter whether the SEC or Coinbase won in court, ultimately at the end of the day, there's a new head of the SEC, and we just talked about with Ari all the changes that's going to be there. But it's important to note, Jen, that those changes are going to take place whether or not Coinbase was right or the SEC was right. And Gary Gensler put out video on his last day as chair, trumpeting his accomplishments. And there is a group of people who still believe that Gary had the correct approach. And to have a federal judge come out and criticize the SEC in this fashion is actually well-respected judges coming out and saying Paul and everyone at Coinbase was right. And this wasn't well reasoned, and this didn't make sense. And I think that still matters because you ultimately want the entire country to buy into the policy changes that there are going to be and the rulemaking that the SEC and the CFTC are going to be putting forth. You want to win over skeptics. So I think it's actually quite important. And in many ways, Coinbase was doing the yeoman's work for the entire industry by litigating that case.
Renato, a long time ago, under a different regime. We were in a very different time. You told me that you advise clients who are launching tokens maybe to not do that in the United States. We are 3 days into a new administration. How are you advising your clients with all of this change happening?
Yeah, I actually now it's a very exciting time. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of interest in the space. We're putting out like on a weekly basis. I just put the finishing touches on our weekly crypto policy tracker because essentially people now what we're basically telling folks is get your products ready and wait and see because we're going to have all these rules and regulations that are going to be coming out. So the United States is now going to be, I would think, the hot place in the center for crypto, which really is what I think that the president just announced recently was his goal. So I do think that that rollout will have an impact. It's already starting to have an impact in terms of the interest of clients.
We've talked about this and we've talked about it a lot on CoinDesk, on other shows too, about how the US was really falling behind many other parts of the world. And this is just a feeling, it feels like we have accelerated so much in such a short time. It just feels like, we're not going to be playing catch up in the US. It feels like the energy that you feel in some of the other places in the world that have clear regulatory frameworks that are supporting crypto businesses is here. Is that what you're feeling?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, where we were before was essentially like during the birth of the internet. If the Clinton administrations tried to have like a war on the internet companies, we had all these internet companies that were starting in the United States, and that would have really dampened that growth. And here, despite what the prior administration was doing, there was a lot of growth in this space. There was a lot of people here in the United States. It's not a coincidence that so many of the companies and so many of the individuals that we have here are based in the United States, and their companies are based in the United States, but yet they were essentially running uphill. And now it really has to feel to them like they're over the mountaintop and they're running downhill on the other side.
All right, Renato, I want to talk about our last story. This is the one I've been waiting for the entire show. Ross Ulbricht, the founder of the Silk Road, is a free man. He was pardoned by President Donald Trump, and it was a full and unconditional pardon. Now, folks on crypto Twitter have been asking what this means. They've been discussing because of that full and unconditional pardon instead of a commutative sentence or something else. Does this mean that Ross would have a claim on any of the assets seized when he was arrested?
So this might be the most interesting and trickiest legal question you've ever asked me, Jen. It was so tricky. I went to my law partner, Leo Zhao, who used to be the head of MLARS, the Money Laundering and Asset Forfeiture, Asset Recovery section of the U.S. Department of Justice. And we spent a while discussing it and pondering through it together. And essentially, the bottom line is this. There's no settled law on this issue, but pardons are supposed to wash away all the punitive elements of a conviction as if the conviction didn't exist. And asset forfeiture, in other words, taking assets from you that were used in a crime or were proceeds of a crime, is a punitive measure. And so I believe that the Justice Department's position will be as to, as criminal forfeiture of assets from Ross, that those assets should be returned to the extent, and this is a big qualifier, that they still exist. Because once assets have been sold, and famously, at least much of the Bitcoin he had was sold for like $330 many years ago.
Which is crazy to think about right now. It's over 100,000 today.
Right, like he would be worth tens of billions of dollars today. But if the goods have already been sold and been kind of absorbed into the general fisc, they would not. They can't be returned. And obviously, there's potential for civil forfeiture, which I think is probably past the statute of limitations. So very interesting because there's still maybe some property out there. I know that I think Coinbase had talked about that there was at least one wallet that they had found with some Bitcoin.
That's interesting. Okay, so basically what you're saying is that if the assets were still there and they weren't sold off, that he would have a right to go back and claim that. Is there any scenario where he could go after the monetary value for some reason?
Yeah, I don't think that would be possible. In other words, it's a punishment that at that point can't be undone. But He may, I mean, it's a potential claim. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he finds a lawyer to bring that suit. I mean, he could certainly reach out to us if he wants, but I think, happy to take that on. I mean, the short answer is there's no law on this, Jen. So really what I'm giving you is, the reasoning. I mean, me puzzling through with somebody who had to make these decisions at the Justice
Mhm.
Department, under the during the prior Trump administration, really trying to figure out, what the Justice Department's position would be. But it's really interesting because it's never really been an issue in the past. Maybe the Paul Manafort situation is probably the closest analogous situation that there was.
Now, Renato, I don't often do this, but we talked about so much on the show today. And like we said, there's so much happening every day. As we move on with our lives, as we wrap up the show, what are you watching? You're so embedded in all of this. You work with so many clients that represent different aspects of this industry. What are you watching closely? What's important to you as you go back to your work?
So a couple things. I mean, one, obviously, we talked a little bit about these agencies. I'm very interested in how that works out. Unlike our Ari, I don't think that there's going to need to be an executive order. I think there's a battle going on right now to determine and a back and forth to try to determine. I mean, everyone's going to try to want to have a piece of this regulatory pie because it's going to change the trajectory of these agencies. So I think that that's one thing I am watching very closely. I also am very interested in what Mr. Sachs' role is going to be.
Mhm.
I've heard differing accounts regarding that. Whether he's not really all that important, or I mean, as Ari suggested, he thinks that he's going to be really the voice of the president on these issues. So I'm very interested to see that. And then I'm really interested in the question that I had asked Ari. I'm very interested to see what happens with all of these enforcement matters. And I personally think there's going to probably be three buckets. I mean, I think there's going to be enforcement matters that will disappear, like you said, probably those matters against Coinbase and others. I do think that there's going to be some, like he said, I agree, that will continue onward because they're against really evil doers. But I do think that there's sort of a middle ground. There's going to be some enforcement matters where it's like, well, the person did something wrong, the entity did something wrong, but there's a goal in trying to move things forward from crypto and not looking backward. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are favorable settlements in certain matters. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I think we're going to have so much to talk about every two every 2 weeks. You're right. We may need to
Yeah.
do this more often because I think there's going to be a lot of that happening in the months to come.
You may not have an answer here. Really, I'm just asking you to speculate. But if some of those cases do go away, like the Coinbase case and some of the other ones against some of the other exchanges that are operating in the United States, where it's not clear that someone has done something wrong, how quickly do we see those go away if they are to go away?
Oh, I think in a matter of weeks. I mean, already, the Trump administration has said in certain contexts, like for example, they've told the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to put every open matter on hold, like not to move anything forward on any matter. And I really think with the SEC, you're going to see the acting chair start to evaluate all of those cases. Now, the question is going to be there. There's a nominee, and Adkins is going to be coming in, and the question is he going to want to play a role in that, and they'll wait till he's confirmed. In the case of the CFTC, we don't have an appointee yet, and we've heard speculation, but Caroline may just want to go forward herself with and start making some decisions. So I expect us to be talking about those cases every 2 weeks for many weeks to come.
Well, I look forward to it, Renato. As always, it is a pleasure co hosting this show with you. I know that it is so valuable to our audience. It's so valuable to me to be able to unpack exactly what's going on and make sense of it for those who are building in the space, those who are investing in the space, those who are just interested in watching the developments of the space. So I just want to thank you for hosting this with me every second week.
I feel the same way. I don't know if I'm going to take Ari up on running in the middle of the
Oh my
summer.
gosh.
But you and I can have a drink and watch them. But in all seriousness, I think this is such an important conversation. And for those of you who are watching, if you have input for us, or if you're interested have ideas for the show, or you're interested in appearing in the show, please feel free to reach out to us. We're trying to do our best to further the conversation, because we're trying to fill a void here in terms of a lack of really serious discussion about law and policy in an area that is so important right now for our economy.
That's exactly it. Thank you, Renato, for saying that. And thank you to our audience who watches us every other week. We are live across CoinDesk's socials at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Like Renato said, if you have questions that you want us to answer or you want us to investigate, please send them to us. Please let us know your thoughts. We appreciate you watching.